like you, I have also been to Denver and other places at about 1,600 meters. And we get all excited when we go to Denver because it's a mile high. It's the mile high city, and we get worried about what's going to happen to us. What happened to you when you went to Denver, to Colorado, Anaya? Did you? Nothing. Yeah, not much happens. Sometimes it does happen to people, but a mile high, that's nothing. Because when I was a junior in college, I flew in, and I guess I wasn't really doing my homework enough before I just signed up for a year-long study abroad in Quito, Ecuador, which is one of the I think it's the second highest capital in the world, which is 2,850 meters or 9,000 feet above sea level. And at that altitude well, I'll show you in a second exactly where Quito is latitudinally, but it's pretty high. And then I ended up doing some field work in Colombia at 3,100 meters where I lived for a while, which was even colder. And then on one J term, took people to Potosí, Bolivia, the second highest city in the world. Another city in Bolivia above Lima, but Potosí is the second highest at almost 4,100 meters or 13,000 feet. I know, which is really, really high. Now you might wonder, how can it be this way? So if you look at the Alps, and this is basically what happens in, say, Denver as well. So those of you who've been to the Alps or been to Denver, when you get to about, here, 2,000 meters or so, you're getting above the timberline. And then you're getting up, when you get to 3,000 meters, you're getting up into, places where it's mostly snow. And then you do a lot of skiing and you're happy because you're above the snow line. But in the Andes, things are different. If you're at 2,000 meters, you're still in what they call temperate land, and you can grow, coffee and bananas almost, and definitely corn, and maybe even a little bit of coca. And then if you go up, you can, at 3,000 meters, you can still be growing wheat and barley. You're in the cold land, but you're still growing some wheat, barley, those kind of things, potatoes, growing potatoes up to 4,000 meters. Way up there, Lake Titicaca land, until you get above 4,000 meters, and then you're in some really cold area. So, I guess the first thing, what's really cool, one of the things that to me is super amazing about being in the Andes, and I think applies to Tibet as well, though I have not experienced that, is that you can experience these different climactic zones, especially in a place like Ecuador, in a very short distance. In today's world, you would take a bus, but even in today's world, you can walk between zones that are planting corn and planting potatoes and keep walking down to where there's wheat. And then you just, in a one day's walk, you can traverse several climactic zones. And it actually reminds me of, Cass, you said something about the different, what do you need to do to live in these places? Yeah, so in the Andes, in the traditional way, in today's world, they do it through markets and people going back and forth and selling things. But in the olden times, people like to have little different places and different houses and different residences in these ecological zones, or different people that they could trade with so that they could enjoy, or maybe more than enjoy, survive in different climate zones, because each of them produced different things. And there was always interzonal trade and interzonal activity migration. Even today, people will, if you live up here and you live up here most of the time, you'll want to go down and warm up every so often and get to the coast or get down into oftentimes there's even little kind of like, they call them like holes where you can go down and you just go down, 200 or 300 feet in altitude and you can be in almost a different climate. Now you might wonder, well, how do they do this? And the reason you can do this is because Quito, Ecuador is so named because it's right on the equator. It's a few miles up and you can go visit the equator monument that the French team came in and outlined exactly. We were trying to map out the equator. And as we saw in the climate zones, all of these places are actually pretty close to the equator. So even when you get down into, say, Potosí and Sucre, which is where I took people for J-term, and they will never probably want to go again, it's still pretty much an equatorial climate zone, which is to say, you can, if you go down to the coast, you're going to be in the hot tropics. But as you go up the mountain, it totally changes your climate situation. Interestingly, well, the thing is, in a place like Quito or even in Sucre, when you get to about 2,800 meters, they used to say that we're the city of the 4 seasons. We have 4 seasons in one day. And so they would try to tell me that it's spring in the morning and summer in the afternoon and fall in the evening, and in the nighttime it's winter. And it's not exactly like that, it never gets really hot and it never gets really cold like what we're experiencing now. But it is kind of like that. The daily variation between night and day is quite dramatic. And so you'd be walking out in one weather and by the middle of the day you're in a t-shirt, but at night you're shivering or doing non-shivering thermogenesis if you have the ability. So there's a lot of within day variation. The other interesting thing about living in this area is that the days and the nights are always the same. Sun always comes up at 6 o'clock in the morning and it always sets at 6 o'clock at night, all your life. So I remember very distinctly talking to this one old guy, and I said, we were talking about seasons, and he totally understood cold and hot because he experienced those. You just walk up and down the mountain, you're hot down the coast, you're cold up in the mountain. He knew all about cold and hot. And then I tried to tell him that the sun came up at a different time, and in the winter time the days got shorter, and the summertime the days got longer. And he looked at me and he said, no, that can't be right. Could not relate. And it's the kind of thing that if you grow up in a world in which the sun always comes up at the same time and always sets at the same time, tiny bit of variation throughout the year, but very tiny. It's hard to imagine living in a world at 42 or 44 degrees latitude. So it's very much unlike the Arctic, a different kind of madness. Now, when the Europeans first came to places like the Andes, one of our students who could not be here gave us a quote from page 148 to 149, which talked about how the colonial Europeans, Spanish documents from the early colonial period that explained and probably exaggerated that no European woman could carry a child to term at high altitude. Air was too thin, they said. We can't live up here. To go down to the coast instead. Now they may have just been, like I said, being exaggerating because they didn't want it to be up so cold. But the idea was that the only people who could live up there were the people who were indigenous or native to the area. And Tyler, you talked about this as well, because what is different about high altitudes versus just being in the cold? Now, wait, but why did you think about that? Like, what's the difference between being adapted to just the cold and being adapted to the highlands, the altitude? What happens at the high altitudes? Yeah, the hypoxia, which you can't culturally adjust for. You can't, it's kind of like when you ever, you ever been at home and you get kind of cold and your parents all you just put on another coat. You ever heard that, you can just put on another layer, or you just start a fire, turn on the air conditioning. We can deal with temperature. But if you have a high altitude problem, you can't deal with it culturally. I guess you could try, but really the only way to deal with it is to go down. You have to go lower. You have to reduce your altitude. It's the best way to deal with it. And so human beings do have, it's a different kind of adaptation. Now, this does make people think about the biological species concept and whether all the people are from the same species. And I want to be very clear here, my friends, for those of you who have not been with me in intro, that human beings evolved in Africa and we expanded from Africa, and we have always been a single biological species, which means that whenever we find each other, we can all, population-wise, that is, not everybody individually can interbreed, but as populations, we can interbreed. So as human beings expanded from Africa into other zones, there was always going to be trade and interaction. It's not just in the Andes or the mountains that you need resources from different zones. People always have been in contact and marrying each other and doing all kinds of funny things with each other. And even when there were periods of what we would call continental isolation, Australia is an example where people went to and became migrated into Australia, particularly amazing human feat, or into the Americas, which is also kind of amazing as well. People come into these areas, but then were relatively isolated in the case of Australia for about 60,000 years from other human groups. Now in the Australia and in the Americas, people were intermixing and intertrading and interbreeding with each other. But even in the cases where they were isolated from each other for 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 years, whenever we come into contact with each other, humans have this thing where they like to see if the species concept is going to work out again. And it always does. As one of my old professors used to say, if you're thinking about the largest Swedish person and the smallest African pygmy, yes, they can get together and interbreed on a population level, of course. Not all individuals can get together, but on a population level, human beings interbreed and interconnect with each other whenever we come into contact. So don't worry, the species concept has never been outmatched by human beings. So what does that mean? Most human expansion has occurred through cultural adaptations, the ways in which we build houses, put on clothes, turn up the heat, expose ourselves to the cold. And there has been, over the years, though, when different populations meet each other, there has been a tendency to exaggerate the supposed physical or genetic differences of the people who live in that area. Right, Anaya? Yes. What was your quote? I forgot. Or what did you get out of it?
And that if those people were to travel to high altitude, that they would like experience serious problems, but that's not the case. Well, it was never going forward.
Right. Populations native to high altitude were once thought to have genetic adaptations that permitted them to reproduce and live with no apparent difficulty, whereas outsiders would seriously malfunction. It now appears that there is no direct evidence of population-level adaptation to hypoxia in humans, but only indirect evidence based on inferences from let me get the rest of that sentence, from individual and infra-individual adaptations. So again, it's kind of like what we talked about in the Arctic. People would go up to the Arctic and be like, look at these fat Eskimos. That's why they're fat. That's why they do the cold. And look at their eyes. That must be an adaptation to the cold. Untrue, right? We find out the Inuit are actually quite physically fit and they didn't have massive body mass and there wasn't really genetic adaptation and they have to wear visors whenever they go out and traveling as well. So it doesn't seem to be adapted. So you'll notice this tendency, and that's why sometimes I get excited about it when people exaggerate these differences, because it's been a long tendency of Europeans to go around and be like, how do you do it? They must be specially adapted. We can't live here. Anyway, so most human expansion is through cultural adaptations we can all do. A lot of the biological changes that we see is from being raised in an area where you're eating the diet of that area, which can cause quite a lot of biological difference if you're in a calcium-rich diet versus a protein-rich diet versus a mostly plant-based diet. It definitely influences your developing body. And if you're being exposed to cold on a regular basis as you're developing so that you can retain that non-shivering thermogenesis, or if you're up, the people who are actually born in high altitude do develop greater lung capacity if they are developed there. But if you were born there, you would probably, or if you went there and had children there, you would also develop a higher lung capacity. So a lot of this has to do with the fact that humans are a very biologically plastic species. It's called plasticity. It doesn't mean we're made out of plastic. It just means we're flexible and adaptable, so that our development depends a lot upon the kind of food and climate and social activities that we grow up in. And we would not be the same people if we grew up and were raised in a very different environment. Even things like our skeleton, for example. In our society, we learn how to sit. We learn how to sit by what some people call legs hanging off the chair. We learn how to sit instead of learning how to squat. In many societies, especially in the old days, people learned how to squat. And if necessary, you could all just squat for 2 hours without even having your knees go, you'd be fine. I often ask students to do this for a couple hours, but I got tired of it because my knees screamed to me in pain. However, if I had been raised in a squatting society, your skeleton can actually develop a notch. But then you can squat. It'd be fine. So again, the humans have a lot of biological plasticity depending on where we grow up. So Victoria, you got very, very anxious about people having bare feet. True. Sounded dangerous.
I feel like there's a lot of chances, especially with like farming and everything, that step on stuff and like it's stabbed in your feet. Like that just doesn't seem that good of an idea to be walking around barefoot all the time.
Doesn't sound like a good idea. And no, I don't think it's a good idea for me or for you, because we grew up with shoes on all the time. One of the first things we're given. We have all these shoes and laces and boots and all these things. So our feet are barely able to do anything. And every time we step on something, like, ouch, ouch. I was in Colombia, I'd be walking down, with people who normally wore shoes. We were walking down the road, and this person I knew, and she just takes off her shoes, says, so much better, and just starts walking in bare feet. Do I want to do that? No, I do not, because my feet would get cut to shreds. I'd be sad. Now, if I had done that for a year, I'd be okay. But if I'd grown up doing that a decent amount, exposing my bare feet to the elements and all those things, then it's fine. In fact, raise your kids in bare feet. See what happens. They'll be fine. Step on anything. Oh, I shouldn't give parenting advice. I didn't do that. Anyway, the thing is that we all become biologically different as we grow and we eat and we do things in different environments. So my message here is be careful. There is some genetic adaptation to different environments. It has never broached the species concept. It hasn't even broached the subspecies concept. There are actually no subspecies either in the human population, but in general, this is how we do things. So that all said, oh, yes. Oh, and I wanted to point out that in Potosí, one of the highest cities in the world, at 4,000 meters, it became a huge city, one of the biggest cities in the world at its time. At its time, it was bigger than London and Paris at the time of it, because everybody wanted the silver there, responsible for almost half of the world's silver supply. And so everybody knew where Potosí was. People from all over the world came there. People from Africa were brought there. People from Asia were brought there. Indigenous people were sent in to work the mines. So there were at least 100,000 people in this city, and they were, they weren't doing fine. It was hard, but they could live there. They did it. And they're still doing it. It's still a pretty large city. So it can be done even for people who aren't native to it. So how do people live at high altitudes? Back to Tyler's question. There may be, Moran tells us that there may be some genetic adaptations in Tibetan populations, which might make more sense in some ways because the people in Tibet have actually probably been living there for thousands more years longer than the people in the Andes in South America. And in fact, it doesn't seem like we can find any genetic differences with the Andean populations. And the Tibetan populations, there might be. It's still a little bit hard to find, and it seems to be a lot of regional variation, but that it may be true. The big differences are the biological differences for people who are born at and grow up in high altitudes. That is something which, when I went there, when I moved to the altitude, I could live there and I adjusted to it, but being able to work there, being able to live there over time, it's better. It's better if you're born there and raised there. And then usually they have larger lung capacities and different stuff happens in the blood. So you get increased work capacity at a high altitude, kind of like people who go there to cycle or do athletic training at high altitudes so that their oxygen levels are reduced, their blood gets better, and then they come back down and throw cymbals at each other and do athletic activities down here with the commoners and beat us all. So on the one hand, they do have increased work capacity, but there's something really interesting that Moran says is people did studies and they said, okay, let's get these high altitude people down and we'll have them work on the coast. And what do we find? Although natives perform better than newcomers at high altitudes, carefully designed experiments have not shown any significant superiority in natives when they move to lowland areas. So people tried to go up and get some natives from the highlands and bring them down to lowlands and say, wow, these guys are going to be super workers down here. And pretty much the same. So it wasn't I mean, yeah, they were good at working and it's good to do athletic training, but it wasn't that they were Superman. And the other interesting thing about this is that you'd think if that once you develop that biologically and you lived in that area for generations, that you were adapted to high altitude. But even if, well, let me read this. It's kind of crazy and it's strange to see. Following several weeks at sea level, even natives may experience this temporary illness, altitude sickness, when they return to high altitude. So, you go down. I mean, imagine that you're all adapted and you're all thinking you lived in this place and you go down for several weeks to sea level and then you come back up and you get altitude sickness, even if you were native to the place. So this is to say that many of our adaptations to something even as extreme as high altitude are cultural or biological from growing up, and they tend to vary even upon the human experience as you go along. But these are some of the ways in which biologically people adapt and live to high altitudes. Many of the people in Potosí and other places in Bolivia and Peru would say that they need coca to live at high altitudes, right, John? Why?
Well, coca is kind of like studies suggest that the coca is kind of the equivalent, the digestive process of the coca plant is practically the same. It's kind of like copy. Basically, they're just like, we need our morning coca. So instead of just having the coffee machine, they just eat the coca plant.
Chew the coca. Yeah. Coca in its native form as coca leaves is a stimulant, but it's not too much. It's like kind of like coffee, maybe a little more, maybe a little less. Slightly addictive, but not too much. Kind of like coffee, maybe a little more, maybe a little less. It does sometimes help you work like coffee. It does suppress hunger. I don't know if coffee suppresses hunger for you. Some people, it does. Yeah. Oh, okay. Well, coca helps suppress hunger. You can work without it. And some people say it helps you at high altitude. But there's some debate about that. And it does seem to be good for the cold as well. Certainly when I was in Bolivia, they don't use it in Colombia, but in Bolivia, they have like coca tea and stuff that you can just put into your, it seemed like it worked. It seemed good. It seemed like a good thing to do when you can get it. Coca-Cola originally had coca in it. But then we invented cocaine in the 1860s, and then everybody got really upset about coca. And now we can't get coca anymore. Sad, but can't get coca. So even Coca-Cola had to change. But if you go to Bolivia, you can get coca tea and all kinds of different coca products. It's not a big deal. The US kind of went crazy with it. Jacob, there's other things that you can do with coca, or there's other reasons to have it. Universal social lubricant. Sounds kind of like Borgs or something. I just read about those, so now I know them. Uh-huh.
And then it grows at the low altitude, so people that need it in the high altitude will like after and people in the lower altitudes to cultivate it and then back up and use it. Emphasizes that they pick up their stuff.
Yeah, that was really interesting. That was really kind of crazy, right? It grows at low altitudes, but you need it at high altitudes. So you have to go down and not piss the coca growers off and get your coca and bring it back up or trade it around. And yeah, it has all these ritual aspects and you need it. And have these neat little colorful clothes on, and you sell it and buy it and trade it and exchange it. And it's in ritual. It's the universal social lubricant. It sounds weird, actually. I was when I was reading about Potosí, I found that the Bolivian president, this was in January 2022, they have a national coca chewing day. I know. I think this is National Banana Bread Day or something like that. Didn't we have that today? Anyway, in our country. Yeah. Well, maybe National Coca Chewing Day is made up as well. But anyway, they're gonna try and come up with a coca toothpaste, which is definitely gonna be the stuff to have. Prevents cavities. Yeah. So that's one way to live at altitude. Liz, what can we do with these?
They could survive. So, people high up. Use them for a variety of things, like meat, milk, fur, and food for fertilizer or energy use as well.
Yeah, one of the few, maybe the only domesticable large animals in the Americas, the llamas, and we're actually quite crucial to extracting all that silver from Potosí and transporting it, because if you try to march a horse up to 4,000 meters really fast, they might just die. So the llamas are adapted to that. Alpacas too. So they can be very useful at high elevations. And then it turns out the yaks too, they have some special lung cells that helps them just be agile and awesome at high altitude. So that's more like the Tibetan plateau. So you have the llamas, alpacas, and over in the yaks. Mountain advantages. You might wonder, being up there so high and being so cold and dreary, if there's anything good that can happen to you. Zeke was telling us about some plants that are up there. And it is also true that you get a lot of solar radiation up there. So at least where I was, they seem to be able to be pretty productive with potatoes and other things. I'm not sure if it was just because they had nothing else going on, but they do get a lot. You want to be very careful with the sunscreen. Even if it's cold, you have to have a lot of sunscreen up there. Well, when you're skiing too, right? Oh, goodness, right. So you know about that. The solar radiation in the plants can have some advantages up there. So also, if you go up really high into the Bolivian and Peruvian places, because the sun comes out so strong during the day and then it freezes overnight, there's these processes that you can use where you can basically put your potatoes out and they freeze dry. It takes a while. It's a traditional process, but it's a natural form of freeze drying things. Yes, freeze drying is itself natural, but you can do it in the open air. Of course, herding, different populations of llamas and things live there, and it can be a good place to herd animals. And as noted, is a special important source of minerals like silver, tin. Good stuff for cell phones now. They're mining up there, which is probably not good for the environment, but it's up there. One of the things I most like about going to places like Quito or Bolivia is you're basically above the mosquito line. So you don't have to take malaria pills, and you don't have to worry that much about yellow fever and all those tropical things that can hurt you when you go to the equator and you go below the mosquito line. You don't have to worry about them in the mountains. As Moran says, the children apparently have lower incidences of diarrhea and gastrointestinal problems, which is also an issue, of course, for travelers. And it's a little bit less in the mountains, and so can lead to lower infant and child mortality in some cases. So there's some advantages. As Cass told us at the very beginning, we have to remember that, you know, it's hard to just live at 4,000 meters. It is a harsh landscape. So people who live in these areas are always trading and migrating between different places. But there are some advantages, and there's some really cool things that people have done to farm and terrace agriculture up there. This is a picture of a place below Machu Picchu, incredibly architecturally advanced city of the Incas, and just some pretty amazing terrace agriculture, which was developed at the time. Similar kinds of things are found in southern China and Tibet, very famous rice terraces you can go to. So in the last class, I talked about Arctic importance, and we couldn't just let the Arctic go. I'll do the same thing with high altitude importance. Apparently, the high altitude regions are also early warning systems for climate change. So I don't know, maybe they're all early warning systems. We'll see as we go along, but certainly the mountainous areas can be early warning systems in the same way or differently than the Arctic was a system. I don't think the high altitude is going to cause, it's not like the glacier loss and the erosion is serious and probably cannot be replaced. I don't think it's going to induce a new ice age or cause the same kind of problems as the tundra and permafrost go, but it's important to keep in mind. But like the Arctic, we definitely can learn from things like terraced farming, biological and ecological adaptations to high altitude stuff, different ways of walking around with bare feet. What else did they learn? Oh, coca toothpaste. All those things we can learn from them. And of course, the animals of the future, I say.